So is a mega merger of the main opposition parties likely to lead to not only a more constructive opposition in Nigeria and the strengthening of the two-party system, with one in government and the other in opposition, but to a more effective challenge to the ruling APC party in 2027? That seems to be the central thrust of Atiku Abubakar's call for closer ties between the opposition parties as a way of bolstering support for a vote against the APC at the next presidential election. But in a field dominated by people with the greatest egos imaginable, is this likely to work? Already we've heard from the likes of the NNPP presidential candidate Rabiu Kwankwaso making it clear that he should be its flag bearer. And he's not alone. Many politicians will want to claim the #1 slot, not least Atiku Abubakar himself. But given that many believe that by 2027, Atiku will have been well past his prime in terms of age, having already contested several times and lost, is the race to lead such a party likely to be between Peter Obi and Rabiu Kwankwaso, who came third and a very distant fourth, respectively, in the last election? And given that Nigeria has just had 8 years of northern leadership under Muhammadu Buhari, can any party present a candidate from the north and hope to win in 2027? Well, for more on this, I'm joined now in the studio by one of Nigeria's leading political scientists, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, who's also chair of the editorial board of Nigeria's Premium Times newspaper and senior fellow at the respected think tank, the Center for Democracy and Development. Prof, thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure.
Has this idea of a merger of the main opposition parties passed your political radar in recent days?
You know, the idea of merger is a very old idea in Nigerian politics. It goes back to the 1960s, where when election comes, there will be always two political coalitions. One for the party in government, a second for the opposition. But they are actually being able to merge has been extremely rare, and the APC is the product of one of those very rare situations where there was a merger of political parties to form a bigger party. The logic is right that it makes sense when you are in opposition to merge so that you'll have greater strength. But the whole problem is the question that you raised of ego, but above all, the fact that these parties themselves don't stand for anything in terms of their ideology or sets of principles. Because if they did, then you can look at that ideology and principles and work out something that will meet the expectation of all the parties aspiring to merge.
But I would have thought that would have made it easier for them to merge, because ideology would have been more of an obstacle, wouldn't it? Of all of them coming together.
It would have been if they are very different ideologically. But the issue with ideology is that if you are all in opposition, it's easier for you to agree without being very, very strict with their ideology, because you can all see clearly you are a higher goal, which is a faster route to power. But because there is no ideology in this case, what comes out very clearly is the ego and the ambition of the individuals. And what we know is that these individuals have been hopping from party to party for a long time anyway, depending on what their personal situation is and the ambitions they have in a particular point in time. And this is what makes it difficult, because each one is just looking at their own desires, their own ambitions, and their egos.
So merger, a good idea, but ego likely to get in the way and to scupper their plans even before it goes anywhere. Does this suggest that all the leading candidates and their parties have now got past their defeat in the 2023 election and are now looking towards the 2027 presidential election? In other words, they've rested the 2023 ballot.
I think the 2023 ballot is rested and people are looking forward. But I think it's also important to know that these may not be the only key players for the next round of elections. Peter Obi, who was a key player in this year's election, a few months before, the party wasn't really on the cards and wasn't seen as somebody that would play an important role. In 2-3 months, he emerged as a real threat in terms of beating the other candidates. And as you know very well, some of his close followers believed he actually won the elections. So there's always a possibility that new players will come up. I think the fact of the matter is that players like Atiku Abubakar, for example, he's been seeking the presidency since 1993. And a lot of Nigerians are beginning to think, well, wait a minute, don't we have other good candidates that can offer something? Especially as this particular individual or these individuals have had so many opportunities which they were unable to take, and therefore maybe the time has come for new faces to emerge. We do know it's not easy for new faces to emerge. There are stumbling blocks, including in particular money and resources, but there are always ways of going around these stumbling blocks. So I think it is also important for Nigerians to start looking around for new political actors that may create better conditions for political transition in the future.
That's an interesting point. And what is your assessment from those, I mean, I don't know if I should now call them old guard politicians, given what you're saying, but the ones who've actually who competed, I suppose, the front runners in 2023. I mean, beyond Atiku, who is the one who's obviously mooted the idea of opposition parties merging to prevent the entrenchment of a one-party state, as you put it, in Nigeria. What is your assessment of the reactions to that idea so far? We've heard the Labour Party calling it broadly a good idea. The NNPP also agreeing, but saying it would only get involved if its presidential candidate, Rabiu Kwankwaso, becomes the flag bearer of the new merged party.
Well, I think maybe we should remember what happened in 1978 when parties were being formed for the Second Republic. And the decision of Nigeria's political class in 1978 was that they should all coalesce in one mega party and share power. There was a lot of work that went into it over years of military rule. They consulted extensively and reached an agreement that once politics returns, they should form what was to be called the national movement. And all of them should enter that movement. And all of them will enter the party when it is registered. And there will be no other competing parties. And politics will be beautiful in Nigeria because everybody will be in the same party. So the national movement was formed. All of them were in. And then they started talking to each other on who will be supported for the presidency. Awolowo wanted it. Aminu Kano wanted it. Metamasile wanted it. Shagari wanted it. Waziri Ibrahim wanted it. And that's how, one by one, they all moved out of it. So in a sense, what Kwankwaso is saying is the history of the attempts at mega party in this country, that at the end, self-interest is much more a priority than collective interest. And merger would always involve a certain agreement of key actors on what the collective interest is that would be served if they merge, which would make the individual actors suppress their own ambitions. Because everybody who wants power is ambition has ego. I mean, by definition, that's why you feel you, rather than anybody else, should occupy a position of power. So that's not the problem. The problem is, what are the conditions under which members of this group that want power will suppress their own personal ambitions? And the problem we have in Nigeria, we don't have those conditions under which they will suppress their ambition. And therefore, at the end of the day, it is always that ambition that assumes a primary role, and therefore they play out every other thing. And when you look at the key individuals of 2023, as you are asking about, the important thing about them is that when you take somebody like Peter Obi, there's a sense that he is the one with the least freedom on this issue, because he has a huge following that idolizes him personally as a person. And that huge movement behind him will not accept that he suppresses his own ambition for somebody else, because he is seen as the political savior himself.
That's a very interesting point.
In terms of conquest, so of course the problem is the results of the elections shows a very serious limitation in terms of his geographical spread. For Atiku, he's made too many attempts at this position, and increasingly people have been asking, now only you want power for this country. So that feeling that he's been on it for too long has risen for most people, and therefore the possibilities for him emerging again as a credible candidate is very limited.
That's a very poignant analysis there, hugely illuminating. But they did it, though, with the APC. I mean, there were quite a few sort of large egos, including Bola Ahmed Tinubu himself at the time, but they cleared the way for Muhammadu Buhari to lead the way, sort of thing.
Well, yes, that happened, but that was because there are specific conditions that made it possible. First of all, Buhari had shown his capacity to generate significant number of votes, especially in northern Nigeria, and is therefore somebody that almost nobody else from that zone could compete with in an electoral sense. Secondly, there is a huge movement that came out to support him. And that movement meant if they did merge, their chances of accessing the presidency was very high. The third issue, and that was the critical condition, was that having made previous attempts, that's Buhari, and failed, it had become clear to him, as well as to the others, that his northern vote was not sufficient to deliver the presidency, and that therefore merger was imperative, because the question of merger had arisen in an earlier election, and he wasn't really ready for it and scuttled it at the end of the day. But having gone through another failed attempt at being elected president, it then became clear to him as well that he really needed the merger. And for the others who wanted to merge with his party, they also saw it as their first stepping stone to accessing power and opening doors for future possibilities. And that's what happened, as you are very much aware.
Very interesting. But of course, the APC of then is not quite the APC of now. The reaction of the APC so far to this merger idea of opposition parties, they've said they are not threatened by it. But going behind the headlines, do you detect that they might be slightly rattled or not bothered at all?
I think if the merger talks become serious, they will definitely be rattled. But part of their tactic as a ruling party would be to do everything in their power to scuttle the attempt at the merger. And part of that really is to weaken the individual parties as much as they can, so that their perceived strength will be reduced in the eyes of the electorate and the voting public. And maybe, I say maybe, that's part of what we are witnessing today, with a flurry of judgments that indicate bias against a specific political party.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting angle, but that's a different story. I mean, some have suggested that that all this is a plot by Atiku for his own personal gain, and that he's got something up his sleeve, clearly wanting to lead. I mean, what do you reckon? Does it sound like he's ready to give up or not? I mean, he doesn't sound like he's going to step aside for anybody.
Well, the history of his that we know is that he's always been really laser focused on this specific ambition that he had, and has always had a very strong belief that he's going to make it. He's not likely to change at this point in time, but it's the conditions that are changing, and part of the changes that are occurring are that a lot of people who would have supported him are beginning to pose questions on why don't we get a fresher alternative that may be more impressive to Nigerians as a whole. And I think that idea, that ongoing discussion, may be his greatest challenge.
Presumably, though, there is enough time to consolidate such a party between now and 2027. I mean, do you think Nigerians are interested in discussing this right now, some 4 years before 2027, or are they more concerned with the cost of living crisis and how the Tinubu administration is handling that?
Well, I think all Nigerians are very concerned about the cost of living crisis, but whether or not that crisis exists, the question of political parties and elections is also on the table. So they have to reflect on both of them. My sense is that maybe the biggest lesson from the 2023 elections is that a large section of this country is actually looking for new blood and new ideas. That's the message that I take out of the 2023 elections. And in that case, maybe a merger under the leadership of the PDP that has ruled this country for 16 years, and where the same individuals are being represented over and over again, may not be the most practical, and that alternatives to existing key actors may be something that makes a lot of sense, and that in any case, Peter Obi, who emerged as a key actor in the elections and who has a large following and who is still relatively young, may be seen as a figure around which a coalition can be organized. But in that case, PDP may not be a major player in that coalition if it's under the leadership of the Labour Party.
Well, let's pick up on that point about the Labour Party. I mean, for instance, because you've talked about the fact that, Peter Obi had, a sizable following in the obedient movement, which is essentially made up of the young people of Nigeria. And I'm wondering if they're likely to be, whether or not, I mean, the issue is not so much for them whether Peter Obi leads, but the fact that he would be going into a coalition or a kind of alliance with the likes of the old guard politicians from the PDP that a lot of these people oppose, or would they be likely to go along with it if Peter Obi becomes the presidential candidate of this proposed mega party? In other words, they'd swallow whatever it is they have against the old guard and say, well, let's do it.
No, I think definitely if he emerges as the presidential candidate, they would accept that type of merger. And in that situation, it appears as if for the three political leaders, the condition under which they accept the merger is that if they are the candidate, in which case is dead on arrival.
So, I mean, beyond all the merger talks and so on, I mean, some have argued that a lot of it will also depend on the performance of President Tinubu between now and to 2027. I mean, if he does spectacularly well, most people wouldn't care whether he gets a second term, or they'd actually be interested in him having a second term. I mean, what's your assessment of the Tinubu government so far? Do they seem capable of meeting Nigeria's main challenges at this very consequential period in this country's history?
I think there's a sense in which so far it hasn't been as impressive as people had expected. One of the expectations was that they have a very strong economic team that will be able to put Nigeria back on the wheels of recovery. But the actions taken so far, when you look at the results and outcome, is not at all impressive. And in fact, it's become a real problem for them, even able to defend what is now the policy option they are proposing to follow. As you may have noticed, they are talking less and less of economic policy these days, as they were at the beginning, when they had this confidence that they knew the answer. So their own confidence has been shaken considerably by the failures of the policies they have put in place, which had not produced the results they and Nigerians expected. It is everybody's hope that they are able to revamp the policy options before them and get back on the rails very soon, because people are really suffering from the cost of living crisis. And if a solution is not found to this crisis, I think there's a real fear of a breakdown of the whole system due to basically hunger and suffering of the people.
Very interesting, as always, talking with you, Prof. Professor Jibrin Ibrahim is one of Nigeria's leading political scientists. He's also chair of the editorial board of Nigeria's Premium Times newspaper and senior fellow at the respected think tank, the Center for Democracy and Development. Thank you very much indeed.